All right, hello y'all and welcome back. So we've defined the term possible. Now I want to define another term, contingent. Contingent. Contingent means that something could not happen or could not have happened. Now, just about everything that you can think of is contingent. It's a contingent fact that I'm talking. It's a contingent fact that I have hands. It's a contingent fact that I exist at all. It's a contingent fact that you wore the particular pair of socks that you wore today. It's a contingent fact, for that matter, that Donald Trump won the 2016 election, or that the Allied powers won World War II. None of those things had to happen that way. As a matter of fact, it's a contingent fact that the universe exists at all. The universe is not a necessary being. It doesn't have to exist. It could, in other words, not have happened. We use this in ordinary language when it comes to job postings. You'll see a job that says, position offered contingent on funding, which means that while usually the best qualified candidate gets the job, admin might pull the plug and say there's no funding available for this job, sorry, in which case nobody gets the job. So it could not happen. What could not happen? That somebody gets the job. Okay? So contingent means could not happen. Now, just about everything you can think of in these possible worlds is also contingent. But not everything's contingent. The next term that we're going to look at is the opposite of contingent, and that is the term necessary. Necessary. Now, necessary in the strong and strict sense means can't not happen, must not happen, must be the case, or, here's what in Texas we call the kicker, is true in all possible worlds. If something is necessary in the strong sense that we're talking about now, not necessary to be convenient or necessary for physical life or whatever, but just necessary period, necessary full stop, as our British friends say, it's going to be true in all possible worlds. Can you think of a necessary truth? Well, at first it might seem difficult to think of a necessary truth, but after just a bit of thinking, it's not very hard at all. Here's one. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's true in all possible worlds. True in worlds where there are no human beings. True in worlds where math hasn't been invented, right? In these worlds, these empty, barren, uninhabited planets, it's still true if you have 2 of these planets and 2 more planets drift by, you've got 4 planets there, right? It's always going to be true. Here's another one that's a little more controversial. Bachelors are unmarried males. Bachelors and unmarried male. This is going to be true even in planets where there are no men, where the women realize they don't really need us, just get rid of us and there's no men there. True also in sort of, I guess, an opposite planet where all the men are married, with this happy land, right? So there's no such thing as a bachelor. It's still going to be true that if you have a bachelor, you have an unmarried male. It's still going to be a definitional truth that if you got a bachelor, you've got an unmarried male and you cannot have a married bachelor. Okay? So this is true no matter what. These are necessary truths. True in all possible worlds, even worlds where there are no people, no concepts, no nothing. Okay. Now that we've got these terms, let's define our last term before we get into the actual argument. The last term to be defined is God. Now this is where it might get a little controversial. You say, hold on just a second. How dare you define God? Well, I'm not defining God. I'm leaving that to 2 kinds of people. Theists, believers in God and all different religious traditions, and atheists, okay, who don't believe in God, who reject belief in God. And believe it or not, theists and atheists agree on the definition of God. God is a perfect being. Perfect being. What does this mean? Well, God possesses the perfections of being and possesses them in the most perfect possible way. So what are some of these perfections? Well, it's good to know. God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. It's good to be able to do things. God is all-powerful. He's omnipotent. And God is morally perfect. Just like we sometimes do good things and sometimes do bad things, God does only good things and cannot do bad things. Okay? So he possesses these perfections of being. And I say atheists agree with believers in God because they have to agree. If you hold to a different conception of God and you don't believe in that God, you haven't succeeded in being an atheist. In order to be an atheist, you have to hold the exact same conception of God that a believer in God does, except you reject it, except you believe that it's imaginary, whereas the theist believes that that thing is real. Now, are there other conceptions of God? Of course. The Greek gods, for instance, are not morally perfect. They're not all-powerful. They're limited in their power and their knowledge and their perfection. But that's not the kind of God we're talking about here. For our purposes here, we're talking about the gods that all major monotheistic religions believe in and that atheists disbelieve in, right? And for good reason. This is the big one. This is the main central conception that we need to be talking about here. Again, God is a perfect being. Now, if we stop at omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection, we don't yet have God. Why not? Well, it's not because God doesn't have those properties. He certainly does. But because God possesses the perfections of being in the most perfect possible way, do you see? And here's what I mean by that. To believe in God is not to believe in a being that is powerful but used to be weak. Or to believe in a being that is omniscient but might have been uninformed. Or to believe in a being that is morally perfect but sometimes slips up and makes mistakes and does morally wrong things just like the rest of us. No. To believe in this kind of God is to believe in a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect and could not have been otherwise. Right? So possessing the perfections of being, but possessing them in the most perfect possible way. Most believers in God believe that they will themselves one day be morally perfect in heaven. Nobody's sinning in heaven. Nevertheless, that doesn't make them equal to God, because while God possesses the property of moral perfection necessarily, he's never in his entire existence sinned, right? Ordinary human beings, despite the fact that they will be morally perfect, are not morally perfect now they do wrong things. So God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and morally perfect, and is so in the most perfect possible way, meaning that he could not have been otherwise, meaning that God is perfect necessarily. Necessarily. So again, remember that if something's necessarily true, it's true in all possible worlds. Okay, now we don't yet have God here, right? But we have the definition of God. God is necessarily omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect. Because again, if you say, no. When I'm talking about God, I'm talking about a being that's all-powerful, but used to be weak. Suddenly, you're not talking about God anymore. And you're not a believer in God, and you're not an atheist, because you're not referring to deny or affirm the existence of the being that we're talking about when we talk about God. See, we hold the definition of God fixed here in order to be believers in God or to be atheists. You have to agree on that definition. So God is a being that's necessarily omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect. With those definitions in mind, possible, contingent, necessary, and God, we'll move on to the argument in the next video. I'll see you then.